There was a study done by a consulting firm, I think it was DDI, that found that the average manager waits 14 months before giving feedback or addressing a performance problem. 14 months. Think about how long that is. And think about how much behavior or performance could compound over time. And it just shows that if you don't talk about it earlier, it usually gets worse.
Welcome to You Might Try This, a podcast about learning how to lead without losing yourself along the way. Hosted by executive coaches Stacey and Cade. This show draws on 25 years of experience working with high-level leaders and brings those lessons down to earth. If you're navigating leadership for the first time, managing people, questioning old rules, and trying to build a career that actually feels good, you're in the right place. This is You Might Try This, honest leadership advice for ambitious people who still want to sleep at night.
Welcome back. So there's a conversation that you have been putting off, and you probably know which one it is because you've been thinking about it maybe 11 times this week. You just haven't had it yet.
That's right. It might be with somebody on your team, or maybe it's a peer, maybe it's even your boss. And it doesn't have to be a dramatic one. Oftentimes it's not. It's the conversation about some pattern that's been building. Maybe the deliverables keep coming in late, or there's some meeting behavior that's been shifting the room, a misalignment that everyone's started working around because no one's actually had the courage to name it directly.
And what I've seen, Cade, in over 20 years of coaching leaders is that the longer people carry that conversation, the bigger it gets. Not even the conversation itself, but the version of the conversation maybe you're having in your head, the one you've rehearsed. And by the time you actually sit down to have the conversation, you're not even talking about what happened that would have started the need to have the conversation. Maybe that happened a month ago. Now you're kind of weaving in the story you've been telling yourselves about what happened. And usually that story is even worse than the thing that prompted the need to have the conversation or the actual reality.
That's right. And so at the time of our recording, it's coming up on tax day. So today we're going to be talking about some of the taxes that you have to pay when you avoid having a difficult conversation, because every day that you don't have the conversation that needs to happen, you're paying a bit of a courage tax, or maybe a lack of courage tax. But nonetheless, we're going to show you exactly what you're paying. And then we're going to give you some tools to make it easier to have those difficult conversations so you don't have to let them build up.
Great.
So let's put the bill on the table to keep moving with that tax analogy. So when you avoid a difficult conversation, you're not avoiding the problem. You're actually just choosing a different, usually more expensive way to deal with it.
Well, there are a lot of different, I'm going to use your analogy, Cade. I'm going to keep going here. So there are a lot of different costs, or let's say taxes, that you accrue when you don't have that conversation. Right. So I know both of us like the work of Susan Scott, who wrote the book Fierce Conversations. And what I like that she said is the conversation is the relationship, meaning the conversations you have with people dictate the kind of relationship you have. And that relationship between you and another person, it's sort of the sum of all the conversations that you've had with them. And if you stop having conversations with them, you basically stop having the relationship. You start managing around the difficult things instead of saying them. And slowly over time, the relationship starts to hollow out or become really shallow or die out a bit. And what I think is ironic is that most people avoid having a difficult conversation because they're trying to protect the relationship. They don't want to damage it. But actually avoiding the conversation for most people causes the damage. So there's like a paradox to this. So if you're staying quiet, and I'm guilty of this, to protect things, the other person starts to fill in that silence with their own interpretation of what happened, right? And then that gap between the two of you, it gets bigger. And usually, since they don't know your side, what they conclude is either wrong, right? They didn't see something that you saw, or they think nothing is wrong, right? So they're like, okay, everything's fine. Stacey didn't say anything. And so they don't have a need to change. Or the opposite. They think, ooh, Stacey's not talking to me. Something is very wrong. And they think, well, she doesn't respect me enough to even bring something up. So
Right.
there's that irony of you're trying to protect the relationship, but actually you're causing damage in two different ways by not bringing it up.
Stacey, I've seen that a lot. I had a client, senior leader, generally cared about her team, but she had a direct report whose work had been declining for probably about 4 months. My client kept telling herself she was waiting for the right moment. But what she didn't realize was that in the absence of honest feedback, her direct report had simply been interpreting the silence as satisfaction. My client, the leader, thought she was being kind. He thought he was doing fine. And so by the time the conversation finally happened, his surprise was like complete and total. And so this silence had cost them more, both of them more than what the conversation ever would have.
I see that a lot too. And it's ironic. I think the more senior people get, the less feedback they get actually, right? And what you're describing is what social scientists call the performance compound, meaning unproductive behavior that isn't addressed compounds over time. We'll go with our tax note, like interest, right? It compounds. Like if I do a behavior and nobody says anything, I think it's okay. I'm going to do it again. And now if I've done it 3 or 4 times, now I have a lot of evidence that my behavior is working and productive. There was a study done by a consulting firm, I think it was DDI, that found that the average manager waits 14 months before giving feedback or addressing a performance problem. 14 months. Think about how long that is. And think about how much behavior performance could compound over time. And it just shows that if you don't talk about it earlier, it usually gets worse.
Yeah, there are so many problems with that 14 months. We'll talk about some more of those. I think a lot of leaders, they don't address the performance because similar to what we were saying in our episode on feedback, they don't want to hurt the other person. Kim Scott, who wrote the book Radical Candor, she calls it ruinous empathy. So ruinous empathy is not a lack of caring. It's actually caring too much about the person's feelings in the moment and not enough about their growth and their performance over time. So leaders in this mode, they want to protect the person so much they're not giving the honest feedback. But what they're actually doing is just depriving them of the information that they need to get better. Thus the ruinous and the ruinous empathy phrase.
I love that term. And I think because we assume more empathy is better, right? As psychologists or, we think, caring for people is important. But the irony here is when you don't have a difficult conversation, you're actually not being nice. You're choosing your own comfort and protecting you from anxiety in the moment over the other person's development or the relationship. So you're making a choice between 3 things: my comfort, improving the relationship, or helping another person get better. So if you don't talk about it, in a way, everybody loses. And the other person didn't get the truth, right? They didn't get an opportunity to do better. And you potentially over time can lose the relationship. And I don't think people think about that cost in that way.
Yes. And not everything is even relational. Yes, there's the damage to the relationship, but there's also the mental price that comes with avoiding a conversation. It's tiring and it's distracting.
It is. I think that's a great point. It's the cognitive load as well as the relationship price, right? And just like we were saying in the beginning, the more you don't have or you resist a difficult conversation, the more you actually end up thinking about it, which is, again, another paradox. So I guess that's another tax, right? The cognitive carrying cost or tax, right? Who's a psychologist? I think Daniel Wegner. Right. He did research on what he called thought suppression. So this is the idea that if you try not to think about something, you think about it more. So his setup was, I think,
the white bear.
That's right.
Everybody knows
that's
that.
right. He told people, do not think about a white bear for 60 seconds. Do not think about a white bear. So of course, what did they do? Thought about the white bear.
About a white bear.
There you go.
So
the conversation you're carrying in your head is kind of like a white bear, right? It surfaces when you're a completely unrelated meeting. You're thinking about it when you're getting a cup of coffee. It colors how you read emails from that person, the tone you might take in another meeting. It takes up a lot of your cognitive energy and capacity, and that's expensive, right?
Yeah.
And the only way to kind of close that loop or stop it from taking that mental real estate is to have the conversation, not to think about having it, not to plan it out, not to sort of anticipate what the other person's going to feel or do, but just to have the conversation. Because anytime you suppress something, you have to think about it as amplifying it, right? So it's the opposite of the performance compound we just talked about, right?
Right. And these costs are real, but there are other reasons people avoid having conversations. I think the reasons feel really legitimate from the inside. Yes, it's true. Most of us actually think that having the conversation will be even worse than it actually is. There's some additional research to what you've mentioned on what's called effective forecasting, which is basically our ability to predict how future events are going to make us feel. And the finding that's relevant here is something called impact bias. And it was Daniel Kahneman and Daniel Gilbert who found that most people, they consistently and significantly overestimate how badly negative events will feel. And that's not by a little, but by a lot.
I was just thinking about that. I had a difficult conversation this week and I spent a lot of time worrying about it. And then when it actually happened, it did not feel nearly as bad as I had anticipated. Where have you seen that show up at work? Because I've seen that in my own life, but where have you seen it show up at work or with clients?
Yeah, well, I would just say that most leaders will typically report feeling relief, like actual relief, within minutes of starting a conversation that they've been carrying around for weeks. The anticipation, again, is always worse. And so with that, there's this dread, there's this anxiety. So what you're dreading, what you're anxious about is the version of the conversation that you've been rehearsing in your head, not the actual conversation with the actual human being.
It's so true. And I think sometimes it helps people to have them reflect on that. Like, I have dreaded a lot of conversations that actually went better than I expected, unless, of course, it's with an ex. Those generally just do go about as bad as I expected. But the other ones, the ones at work, they go a little bit better.
At work. There are things you can do. There are things you can do. I love it. I get it.
But I think that... I think that helping people have, what's called a counterfactual to say, stop, wait, when has a conversation that you dreaded gone better or not been as difficult as you thought can be helpful, right?
Yes.
Particularly
when people are getting so fatalistic about the conversation, which they often do, right?
It's like a rabbit hole.
Yeah. Chris Argyris, who a lot of people would remember from the Fifth Discipline. Some of his work is really helpful here. So, his observation was that humans typically don't respond to reality. They're responding to the story that they've built about reality, which is quite powerful when you think about it, because that building of the story happens very fast. And typically it's without our awareness. It's just happening under the surface. So he compares how we make meaning, build our version of reality to how one climbs a ladder. This ladder of inference, he calls it. Something happens, we then add meaning, and then we draw a conclusion. So that, I think, is always instructive inside of thinking about overcoming the dread and the anxiety inside of a conversation.
That's interesting, Cade, because I do think as humans, we're kind of meaning-making machines. Like, we don't just observe facts and data. They mean something to us and we make them mean. Talk more about, how did he explain people moving up or down the ladder? Like, could you come back down from an inference, for example?
Yeah, sure. And Stacey, you and I have gotten under some of the issues here before with talking about confirmation bias, with talking about situation behavior and impact, attempting to be down at that bottom of the rung of the ladder and getting to the objective data. So that's where you start on this ladder of inference. So you start with observable data, something that actually happened. So, let's say you didn't make eye contact. Your direct report didn't make eye contact in the one-on-one, or he submitted the report without the section that you asked for. That's kind of the bottom rung. That's your observable data. But that's not where we stay as humans. We tend to select which data to pay attention to. Then we add meaning to it. Then we make assumptions, draw conclusions from those assumptions, and then we act out of those conclusions. So by the time most leaders decide to have that difficult conversation, they're not responding to what happened. They're not down at that bottom rung of observable data. They're responding to the conclusion they've reached 6 rungs up the ladder. And that conclusion is almost always more damning than the original observation warranted, you know?
That's interesting. So I give feedback to someone. They look down at the desk. They're not making eye contact. I assume it means they disagree with me. And they're defensive and passive aggressive because they won't talk to me. And this reinforces my belief that they're not committed. Would that be an example?
That's exactly right. And so what leaders would often do is they want to have a performance conversation about that person's lack of commitment. You know, and we talked in a prior episode just about how that's going to shut that other person down because they perceive that in the same way that they would perceive physical threat. So conversations that start from that original observation are going to land much differently than conversations that start from the conclusion. So, you know, in your instance, it's, I noticed that you looked down. Or, you know, one might say to another report, I noticed that the last 2 reports came in missing a section. I just want to understand what's going on. And that's a different conversation than, let's say, after you've climbed that ladder and now you're saying, you know, you don't take reporting requirements seriously. You know?
Damn it. Yes.
So that's why that situation behavior impact model for giving feedback, which we talked about previously, is helpful because, again, talking to somebody about that specific situation is the same as that observable data that's there on the lower rungs of the ladder.
You know, as you're telling this story, it makes me also think about confirmation bias and the idea that we think we are more right than we typically are, and how important it is to have a sense of humility, right? Because we go so quickly from, I saw something and it means this. And if we assume we're accurate, you know, it really gets in the way of us having productive conversations that are difficult. And you're reminding me to take a bit more humility into the conversation sometimes. Right. And question that gap between what did I see and what does it mean to me? Right. Or even asking that question, what did I make that mean? I think.
Yeah. And can we also just kind of like create this shared pool of understanding? Like, so I noticed you looked down. Tell me about that. What's the looking down for? Or you've missed that section. You omitted that section. Tell me about that. You know, the person may just say, man, I forgot. I am so sorry. Or the person may say, hey, we actually didn't have the data from the vendor, so I thought it might be better to get the report to you on time than to have the data, you know, missing or even erroneous. Like, I'd want to know that as a manager before I climbed that ladder and started thinking that person was unprofessional, because in that instance, the person was just trying to meet my need.
That's great. That's a great example. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about like why people naturally, let's call it, or normally avoid conversations. They don't like to. They think they're protecting the relationship. We've talked about, you know, how they might suppress things, and that makes them think about it more and how difficult it is. So let's talk more pragmatically about what are the things people can actually do to have the difficult conversation. And what I find is most difficult often is for people to start. They don't know how to open. They don't know how to begin a difficult conversation. Cade, and you've done something like you talk about the doors, right? What is a door into having a hard conversation?
Yeah, and this is the part of our podcast where we say, hey, how could you experiment with this? What might you try? So, I think you got to recognize that, as you've said, Stacey, not every hard conversation is the same, and there are different doors that you go through. So the first way in is kind of the observation open. So all you're doing is you're starting from the data rather than the conclusion, which is almost always the right instinct, to start from the data. So it sounds like, hey, I want to share something I've been noticing and I'd love to get your perspective on it. That's it. You're starting from the observation. You're signaling the curiosity, not a verdict. The verdict is you're unprofessional, right? The verdict is you don't care. You're simply giving the observation and you're signaling curiosity. You're inviting the other person into that conversation rather than dropping a judgment on them, creating the defensiveness that we know is biological. You're creating what kind of alluded to this earlier. The psychologist Carrie Patterson called it a shared pool of meaning. You're not defending a position. So Patterson's interesting. She argued that the goal of a difficult conversation is not to win. And I've said that to leaders before. Did you have a conversation or did you win the conversation? What was your goal there? So if our conversation, if we can reorient to, hey, I'm not trying to win here, then the goal is to simply add your perspective and your information to this shared pool. so that whatever decision or understanding comes out of the conversation draws on more than just one person's view. I mean, it's obviously unfair to simply get to a verdict, so to speak, from my view. So certainly I want to invite the other the other person in. So, leaders who walk in trying to understand their position almost always produce less understanding than leaders who walk in genuinely trying to understand and be understood.
Cade, I think there's something important in what you're saying, which is it isn't just about the content of the question that you ask. It's also how you show up to listen to the response. Because I've sometimes seen leaders kind of ask a question like that, but they're really alluding to something. They're like, so I observed that you handed the report in late, right? Which isn't really,
People aren't dumb,
they're kind
right?
They're listening to still win. Right. And make a point. So it's both how do you start with an observation, but how do you be curious to create, I like what you said, the shared pool meaning. How do we both look at this together instead of being adversarial? We are looking at things from the same perspective, right?
Yeah, there could be a system breakdown, right? There could be something structural that together we ought to figure out so it doesn't happen again, as opposed to we come, loaded for bear, so to speak.
But what if sometimes I find that starting out with so I noticed works okay if it's a boss, like a manager and an employee. But sometimes if you're closer to the person, like a coworker, and you've got a difficult conversation, that can feel a little clinical or a little off. Like, what do you do if you're a little bit, sometimes I find there's a different opening needed if you're closer to the person,
You're right. I mean, if you came to me, Stacey, with the observation open, I think, I'd look at you like you had three eyes, Sometimes you need something more relational. So the second door is kind of the relationship open. And that's the one where the relationship itself is the thing that you want to anchor to and to preserve, and that's going to sound something like, I want to have this conversation because I think it's going to help us work better together. And I care about that. So you're naming the purpose as the connection, it's not the confrontation. And so, I think especially useful with peers, because we've got to work across. There's no power differential. We know that those can be tricky relationships. Great method to work with people who may become defensive, or when you sense the other person thinks the conversation is going to be worse than it actually is. So if they've got wind of it and they're a little bit antsy, and you start with the relationship open, it's a nice way just to alleviate some of those concerns that you perceive they have.
I think that one paradoxically actually can build trust because it gets at what we were talking about earlier, which is it states that you care about the relationship. And the reason you want to have the difficult conversation is because you don't want to withdraw. So I find that can be that one build where the first one you talked about may build more shared understanding. I think this one builds trust. Right.
I agree with you. I agree with you. And then, of course, there's the third, which is the direct open. And that's when perhaps timeliness matters. And timeliness might matter a little bit more than, say, elegance in the moment, or when the relationship's solid enough that it can hold directness without the scaffolding. Lindsay, our dear colleague, we were on a client call, and she sent me a text and she said, "Watch your eye rolls."
Well, that's rather direct.
That was a direct open, but Lindsay and I love each other, have a lot of respect for each other. I know that it's a weakness of mine, and it probably wasn't that welcomed by the client. Imagine that.
Really? You don't think they like
watch
that?
your eye rolls, And so sometimes in the moment, when you don't have time for the observation open or the relationship open, you just go at it. But just like Lindsay and I have that relationship, you do have to consider the context. I can imagine you and I working together, something's going wrong in front of the client. Again, same example, like timeliness matters. But also, if you were to come to me, like the relationship is already there, right? The observation is there. So I think even with the direct open, you've got to be prepared to underpin it with the relationship and the observation.
I also think the benefit of the direct, as you're pointing out, is people do expect more timeliness overall in conversations these days. We live in an on-demand world, right? Things are short, seconds, quick things. They want that direct open. That's what they actually expect. And I think sometimes for folks who are younger than me, they even kind of expect me to be more direct sometimes, or maybe not more direct, but more timely, right?
And the thing about the direct open, that I do like is there's no room for confusion or ambiguity. As long as you're, again, going back to the right data and it's well grounded, it's clear. And we say often clear is kind, right? So that's one thing I do like about that. And I agree with you. I think that folks a little more junior to us do in fact value it.
I agree. So let's talk about what are things people can try, right? What are the things that they could try this week when they're maybe thinking of a difficult conversation that they have to have?
Yeah. So what do you got? What's one from you?
Well, I like what you said about interpreting the behavior versus observable data. I tend to get particularly attached to my inferences. I like to think of myself as smart and insightful. And so, I can easily go from observing something right up that ladder to believing a narrative about it, right? And sometimes those narratives can get very interesting and ornate, right? And complicated. So I have to work harder to not go up the ladder of inference. And one of the things that helps me is to write down the original observation that prompted my concern. Not the story I've built about it, not what it means, but what did I actually see or hear, right? And that helps me get a little bit kind of more narrow, more focused, and more able to give feedback in a way that people can hear it and more productive.
I think that's really good. What is it that we're hung up on about someone, and where did it start? And is it actually factual data, or is it a bunch of meaning that we've assigned to it that perhaps has no basis in factual data? Yeah, I think that's a good one. Another very simple one is 24-hour rule. So, if you've been thinking about a conversation for more than 24 hours, it's time for a conversation. Maybe not because you've got everything figured out, but the carrying cost has already started and it's probably not going to get easier for you. So I would just think, what's a conversation that you've been carrying around in your head for more than 24 hours? And then how can you begin to do the work of peeling it back to the observational data, thinking about the right open, and also avoiding the belief that it's going to be so bad. The data, the research shows it's not going to be as bad as you think.
I like that too, because it helps with that performance compound. You're more likely to give the feedback quicker instead of avoiding it and letting the behavior that you don't want continue and people believe that it's productive or it's working or there isn't an issue.
And I would just finally say, Stacey, as we say, the conversation that you've been avoiding is not going to get easier. But to round out beautifully the analogy of our taxes, it will get more expensive, right? It's going to get more expensive.
Yes, it will. Yes, it will. I love that. All right. Well, thank you so much, Cade. I really enjoyed this conversation, and hopefully people will try a couple of these things, and we'll see everybody next time.
All right. Thank you, Stacey.
Thank you for listening to You Might Try This, brought to you by EDC and Edgewise Media. To learn more about the podcast, visit youmightTryThis.com or connect with us on social media.